So in this video, we're going to talk about Clerk Elements. Clerk Elements is a library of unstyled components that you can customize to build your authentication components on top of Clerk's API. So why would you want to use them? If you've used Clerk, you already know that it comes with built-in drop-in component from sign in, sign up, user button, user profile, and whatnot. But what if you want to customize those components to look and feel similar to the rest of your app? Well, there are a couple of options. One is that you can use the appearance prop to customize it or style it to some extent. If you want to completely customize it, the only other way you could do it up until now was to use the API. So you could use the Clerk's front-end hooks or APIs or back-end hooks and build your own custom components that talk to these hooks and APIs, which contains the logic to build your own custom components. Now, Clerk Elements was introduced to simplify that process even more. So instead of you having to worry about the APIs or the states and the errors and the steps and the business logic behind the scene, Clerk Element already contains that magic under the hood for you, and you can just on top of it style your elements however you want, that be with class props like Tailwind CSS or using your component library like ShatCN. We're going to build this on top of the next Clerk application we created on the channel a while ago. The link is in the description, where we introduced the Clerk version 2.0 because that's what you need to be able to use the Clerk elements. And I'm already assuming that you have a Clerk account and a Clerk project. If you don't have it already, you can go to clerk.com and create an account and then sign into your dashboard. Once you sign in, you can create a project from there. I've already gone ahead and created my project. Again, watch the video in the description or somewhere in the cart if you haven't set up NextJs with Clerk before. And then we're going to build on top of that application that you can see on the left hand side. I'm going to go over it from a high level. This is how it looks. We have a bunch of pages protected on the server, on the client and API routes. This is already working with ShatCN. It has a light and dark theme, and it is authenticated via Clerk. So inside of the app router, we have the sign in and sign up page. And what we're going to do in this video is that we're going to just replace this sign in component. This is a drop-in component that comes out of Clerk NextJS SDK. We're going to take that out, and instead we're going to use the Clerk elements and customize a sign-in page just to see how easy it is to use Clerk elements. The rest we're not going to touch. As I mentioned, there's protected routes and the API routes, which we're going to protect via the middleware. So let's go to the documentation for Clerk Elements. Let me just zoom out for a second. There is this section inside the documentation that talks about elements. Again, it's in beta, so it's not yet ready for production. There's some guides to build a sign-in flow, sign-up flow. There are examples here that you can use. Again, sign in, sign up. As I mentioned, sign in and sign up are the only things supported right now. They are working on it for this APIs, for this component library to become stable. And once it becomes stable, we're going to have more, such as the user profile, user button. I think these are the two next components that we're going to see. And then there's also an example about ShatCN UI, so you can use your own component library or ShatCN in this case to style your components. And there are some references for the APIs, the props, and values that you can pass into each and every one of them. We're going to follow this, build a sign-in flow using Clerk Elements. Let me make this again bigger. So two things to keep in mind. One is that, as I mentioned, it works with Clerk 2.0. So you need to go ahead and update your Clerk instance to Core 2.0. And then for now, the Clerk Elements only works with Next.js. Support for additional frameworks will be added later. Also, if you're using TypeScript like I am, if you're getting any errors, you need to set the module resolution to bundler in your TS config. So inside of your TS config, there is this module resolution already set up to bundler if you're using the newer versions of Next.js. But if it isn't, you can set it to bundler so you get the types for Clerk Elements correctly. So we're going to follow this guide step by step, and starting from step 1, let me just close this off. So the first step is to create a sign-in route. Now, if you're following along with me or using the library or the package or the repository that I just mentioned, by the way, this is a template. You could just copy this template or clone it into your own repo and use it locally in your machine. And if you're doing that, you already have this sign-in path. If you don't have it, it needs to be an optional catch-all route to not only match this sign-in page, but also any nested paths. So inside of here, as I mentioned, we have this sign-in component that comes from the NextJs SDK. We're not going to use this. Instead, we're going to use the Clerk Elements components. Now, to be able to use this, we need to first install the Clerk Elements package. So let me just stop the dev server here for a second and pm add Clerk Elements. Okay, let's clear this up and pm dev. Let me close the terminal here. So we have the Clerk Elements. Now, the first thing that we have here is this sign-in.root. Again, if we just go back to the documentation as a reference for components, you can see there are different components here, common and sign in. So in the sign in, you can see there are different sections. You can think of Clerk Elements like Radix UI in that there are primitives and they have their components that also have internal nested components. So for example, the sign in, I needed to zoom out for you to see this on the right hand side. So the sign in component, for example, you bring everything from the elements /sign in, name them as sign in, and then you can access everything else under that sign in. For example, you have the root. This is the first component that wraps everything else that contains the states and the errors for all the other steps. And then you have different steps that you can provide for your forms. So initial step to start and then the verification and whatnot. And then supported strategies, actions, or when you wanted to take actions, submit a form, or navigate them to a second step, for example, and whatnot. So you can read through this as a reference. So going back, now this is what we're doing in the first step. We have the sign in. This is kind of encompassing all the sign in related components. So we have the root that is actually wrapping everything here. So let me just make this big again. Now saving this up. Let's go to our component. Let's actually go to the sign in page. Let me actually wrap this whole thing inside of the sections that I had to make this centered and nice. Let's bring in this sign in root. And then now we should be able to see this step right in the middle. So that's the first step. Now, just to see how this pages looked like before I actually deleted them. If I go to the sign up page, this is the drop-in components that comes with Clerk. Again, if you have watched the previous video, you already know how it looks. So this is the drop-in component for sign up from Clerk. And we're trying to replace this with our own custom component, which is this sign-in page. So let's go back to our sign-in page. And now we're trying to recreate this form by styling it ourselves. So in the first step, we install the Clerk Elements library. That step is actually missing from here. I assume that this is because in the overview, they mentioned that you have to install this. In the guides, they don't have it. So you now know that the first step is to actually install the library and then create an optional catch-all route for your sign-in page, and then use the sign-in route to wrap everything else inside of your sign-in flow. Now, the second step is actually including a step, which is the start step. That's where you would render your form or any other social connection or social OAuth logins for your users to be able to create a sign-in. So let's create this a step, which is called start. So let's inside of this root, delete this, and then have this sign-in step, name of start, and we're going to say sign into your account. Now we need to create some form fields to be able to capture information from the users. And this correlates or corresponds with what you have inside of your dashboard. So for example, in this project that I've created, I have enabled email logins. I don't have passwords. I require email verification code. So once you put in your email, there's going to be a sign-in verification code emailed to you, which you could use to then verify this email or yourself and log in. And under the social connections or OAuth, I only have Google. So we're going to try to implement the same thing. Now, the fields and forms you have and the verification steps required for your Clerk Elements matches or corresponds with what you have here in your dashboard. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's exactly what we have here. We have this Clerk connection. This is to render any social connections or your OAuth providers, and then a Clerk field, which is going to act as an identifier, in this case being an email. So let's copy this part of the code and then come in here and then paste this inside of our sign in step. I'm going to change this continue to say sign in with email, because this is what this button is going to do. And let's open up our page and I'm going to explain what's happening here. So as you can see here, this Clerk connection element is rendering this sign in with Google there, which is a button under the hood. So if I inspect this, it's just rendering a button, as you can see on the right hand side. And then I have this email, which is a label and also an input form, and also another button, which is this sign in action, which is going to submit this form created to continue with the email. So let's continue completing our form, and then we're going to style it at the end. So from a high level, again, we have this sign in root. This is everything that captures the state and the flow of our sign in. So it wraps all the other components. I have included my first step, which is the start. This is where I would render buttons and forms and inputs to capture user information to start a signing flow. I had the Clerk connection, which is a button corresponding to my OAuth set up in my Clerk dashboard. In this case, I had Google, so I passed in the name Google to render a sign in with Google button. You can also use Clerk icons to render an icon. So clerk.icon is going to automatically bring in, read the connection. So as you can see here, this icon is reading the connection, the parent connection. Because it is set to Google, it is going to render the Google icon. We're going to style it a little later, but that's my first thing. The second thing that I have is a Clerk field, which is going to render a field. In this case, it's my identifier. It's an email. It can be a username. Again, depending on your setting in your dashboard for your Clerk project, I have the email, an input, and also a field. This is scoped to this specific identifier, to this specific field. So if we have any errors with this specific field, which we're going to see in action in a second, it is going to be rendered here. And then I have this sign in action, which can be submit or navigate, that is going to have an action taken by the user relevant to this form that I am rendering right here. And this step is going to be creating or starting the sign in flow. So let's go back here. So we've copied this. Now, before we continue with the verification setup or the step that we require for the emails, because again, remember inside of my dashboard, I said, if they're using an email, I need them to verify their email using a verification code. So that's a verification step we need to add. But before we do that, I just want to show you that things right now work if we just go ahead and sign in with Google, for example. So I can select an account. There you go. I'm now logged in and I can access any of these protected pages. Now, this is to show that this elements already contain Clerk's API under the hood to take care of the authentication. So you don't have to worry about the business logic and process of actually logging your users in. It's just that now we can customize the look and feel of each one of these elements. So let's sign out and go back to our sign in page, go back to the documentation. So we test that works. Now, we want to add another step for verification. Again, because we have an email and inside of our dashboard, we have enabled the fact that we want email verification via an email code. We need to add that step. We add another sign in step. This time the name is verifications and we set the strategy to be email code. Let's just copy this and maybe I explain it inside of my own code. So that was the sign in step. Now I have another step here, which is verification. It's set to email code. We are informing the client that we have sent an email to their email. This sign-in.safe identifier is going to show them the identifier that they used in the previous step, which was an email for us. And then we have a field again with the code. So if they're going to retrieve the code from their email, and now they need to input that code into the second verification step for us to verify that they are who they claim they are. And then we have the email code input and another error, which is a scope to this field. And then this time our action is submit and says continue. This is to verify their account. So let's go back to our application to this step. Now, let me just go ahead and include a wrong email to just show you what this works. So this couldn't find your account is actually the error that we were rendering in the email field scope. And this is what I meant when I said field error is a scope to this clerk field. Now, because this was used inside of our email, it is showing the corresponding error for our email. And this is what you would style as an error message. For example, I'm just jumping ahead, but I can just say text red 400, 500 and text as small just to show you how easy it is to style these components. Now this is my error message. Now in the second step, similarly, we have the code for verification and an input field for the user to actually put the code, and then there is this field error. And similarly, this field error inside of our verification step is now scoped to this input for the email verification code that we sent to our users. So now that we have this verification step, let's actually go ahead and put in a correct email. So hello@hamidbahram.io, and if I sign in with email, this is going to take me to the second step, which tells me that check your email. We have sent a code to this, and then we have this input to now for the user to put in the verification code and continue. So let me just get the code from my email and come back here. So as you see here, I have received this code. I'm going to copy this. Let me close this off, come back to the application, paste in the code that I got and click continue. And this should sign me in with the same email, this time using the email verification instead of my Google OAuth. I'm still logged in as the same account and I can access a protected route. So now that we have the two steps set up, let's actually talk about styling these elements. So as I mentioned or already touched on, most of these elements you can pass in a class name just like any other React element, as we did with this field error. Let's say this connection, which is going to render a button, we can pass in a class name and say we need a border. Let's just also make this a flex items center, and then let's give it a gap of 4 to just render this like that. We can give it a maybe rounded XL, and then let's give it some paddings for PY1 to render a button there, as you can see. So you can style it however you want. Now again, going back to the documentation, there's a styling section for the elements. As I mentioned, you can use the class name, but if you also wanted to render your own components under the hood, you can pass in the as child prop. So therefore, we can use Tailwind CSS, just as I showed, to style your components using Tailwind classes. You can use the as child prop if you're using your own component library. For example, something like chat.cn, you would render this as prop. This is going to forward the props to that underlying component. You could use CSS modules. You can also use inline styles, as you can see the examples here. So just like any React element, they accept class name and style props. So definitely read through this styling guide to find your suitable method for styling this custom elements. There's also this guide to use chat.cn as your component library. So let's see what we need to do to use chat.cn. So let's make this a bit bigger. So you need to install your app with chat.cn. If you have followed along, this repository or this project is already set up to use chat.cn. You have to add the button, card input, and label because it is used in this code example. So once you do that, these are the icons from inside chat.cn UI for things like Twitter, GitHub, Radix, and whatnot. It is going to render that. So if you want to use this sample code that they have here, you would need to also bring that. And you also need to add in these keyframes or animations to your Tailwind. So let's actually go ahead and do this keyframes. So if you have already installed chat.cn, this has already added some keyframes here for you. You can just add in this specific one. And then inside the animations, we can define this as well. So let's go and define this. Let's also put in a comma here. So that's as far as our Tailwind config. Now we need to add this icon. So you can copy this code And let me just close this off. We're going to come to Components UI and create a file called icons.tsx, and I'm going to paste in the code that I just got out of ShadCN library. This is the icons that are used in here. And now we need to add the button, card input, and the other elements. So let's stop the dev server here. pm dlx shadcn-ui at latest and add. Then we can select which components we want to add. So we need the button, we need the card component, we need the input and the label, and enter. So I already had the button. I'm going to overwrite that to get them fresh. I already had the button inside the starting code for the template. So let's clear this out and pm dev. Let's close the terminal here. So we completed the necessary setup. This is already working with ShadCN. We installed this component. We got the icons and we added this animations to our Tailwind config. Now for this example code that we have here, it's set up with GitHub and Google, so we have to enable GitHub. It is also working with passwords. We don't have a password, but my point here is just to show how we can use ShadCN under the hood to wrap our components or pass in the aschild prop to our Clerk elements to render now ShadCN UI elements. So let's just scroll down to the sign in one. Let's just copy the code here and create another component. Let's call this shad sign in and then tsx. Let's just render this out and let's see what this is from a high level. So again, from a high level, we are rendering this sign in root. Inside of it, we have this Clerk loading. This is another element from Clerk that you can get. You can pass in a render prop. It gives you a global loading. There's also scoped in loadings, and I'm going to show you in a second. So we have the loading. The first step is the start step. We have a card component. This is from ShadCN with headers, titles, and description. And inside of our content, we are creating the necessary contents for this step. As you can see, we have the connection for GitHub as well as the Google. Now, this Clerk loading can also be scoped to a connection, to a button, or to a step like here. Again, you're getting a render prop. Here is loading is the state of this step. So if you're loading, you can render a spinner. This is coming from icons that we just copied from ShadCN. And if you're not loading, we are rendering the GitHub. Similar concept again for Google with the loading. And then down here, we have the fields for the email address. And as you can see, we're passing this as child prop because we're rendering our own label component here. Again, for the input, the as child, we're rendering ShadCN input over here. And inside the footer, again, we have the button. We have the sign in action as child. This means that this sign in action is not going to actually render any HTML element. It just renders the button that we're passing in from our ShadCN, and the rest is just similar. It's just wrapped with Clerk elements. It's just interweaving Clerk elements and our ShadCN elements to create the look and feel that we want. So let's bring in this into our sign-in page and see if this actually works. So let's just delete this wholesale and bring in the new sign-in page. Let's go back here and refresh the page. And there you have it. We have our custom ShadCN component with these buttons, the input field. Everything is coming from ShadCN, combining the Clerk's APIs built into the Clerk elements with the ShadCN UI library for this style to create this custom sign-in page or sign-in flow. So let's recap. Clerk Elements is a collection of unstyled components that has the Clerk's API already built in, and you can use to customize any of these components and style them however you want, whether it's with Tailwind CSS through the class name prop or by using the aschild prop on the Clerk Elements and passing in your own UI components, like in this case, ShadCN UI. Again, this is still not stable, and we're looking for more components to be added to the Clerk Elements library. But it is very powerful in that it gives you the primitives like Radix UI would give you, but it has the Clerk's API or authentication logic built into it and allows you to customize really any of these components and flows. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.